Harlem never truly slept, but on nights like this, it held its breath, as if the streets themselves were waiting for a verdict that no judge could deliver. The rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving the pavement slick and reflective, turning neon lights into broken ribbons that shimmered beneath slow-moving footsteps. Bumpy Johnson walked with the calm rhythm of a man who carried storms inside him, yet refused to let them reach the surface, his coat collar raised just enough to shield him from the cold breeze drifting down Lenox Avenue. Beside him moved Dutch Schultz, quieter than usual, his sharp gaze scanning every doorway as if memory itself lingered in the shadows. The two men did not resemble friends to outsiders, yet the city knew better. They were bound by a complicated respect shaped by survival, a silent understanding that dignity mattered more than power. Only days had passed since the incident at the Savoy Ballroom, when public humiliation had nearly turned a peaceful evening into chaos, and Harlem was still whispering about how Bumpy's steady voice had prevented violence without raising single fist. Tonight felt heavier, as though unfinished business followed them through every block. The theater district pulsed with restless energy, musicians hauling battered instrument cases past crowds dressed in their finest coats, hoping for opportunity but bracing for rejection. A polished car idled near the curb, its driver pretending not to stare as a well-known club owner barked orders at a group of performers who had arrived early for an audition that would never happen. His voice carried arrogance sharpened by prejudice, the kind of cruelty that disguised itself as business. "Not tonight," he told them, his smile thin and dismissive, as if their presence offended the polished glass doors behind him. The musicians stood frozen, unsure whether to argue or leave, and the bystanders watched with that uneasy silence Harlem knew too well, the silence that came when injustice happened in plain sight, but no one wanted to risk becoming the next target. Dutch's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had seen this pattern before, the way humiliation could spread faster than fear. Bumpy paused across the street, studying the scene not with anger, but with an almost scholarly patience, as though he were reading a chapter of a book he already understood. Earlier that evening, an old woman had stopped Bumpy outside a corner cafe, thanking him for keeping things peaceful, her voice trembling with gratitude that seemed too heavy for such simple words. He had nodded politely, never accepting praise easily, because he believed dignity belonged to everyone, not just the man who spoke the loudest. Now that memory lingered as he watched the club owner turn his back on the musicians, the door closing with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Harlem's rhythm faltered. Laughter faded, conversations grew cautious, and the tension that had been building since the Savoy resurfaced like a bruise beneath the skin. Dutch shifted beside him, muttering that the man had no right to treat people like that, but Bumpy only replied, "Rights don't always belong to those who claim them." His voice carried no anger, only a quiet certainty that unsettled even Dutch, who was used to sharper reactions. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched like questions no one wanted to answer. Across the avenue, a nervous bodyguard lingered near the theater entrance, gripping his coat pocket as if it held more responsibility than he could manage. He watched the growing crowd with unease, misreading curiosity as threat, and every movement he made tightened the invisible thread of tension pulling the night towards something irreversible. Bumpy noticed him immediately, recognizing the look of a man pushed beyond confidence into fear, and he sighed softly, understanding how easily fear could turn into harm when pride stood in the way of reason. Dutch followed his gaze, sensing the shift in Bumpy's focus, and for a moment neither man spoke. The city's noise softened into a distant hum, leaving only the quiet sound of footsteps and the steady rhythm of rainwater dripping from awnings. Musicians began to pack up, their shoulders heavy with disappointment, when a young trumpet player hesitated at the curb, refusing to move until someone acknowledged the injustice. His voice rose, not in anger but in wounded pride, asking why talent mattered less than appearance. The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous at the same time. The club owner laughed dismissively, waving him away as though he were nothing. More than background noise, and that laughter spread through the crowd like a spark touching dry grass. But Bumpy placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent request for patience. "Watch," he murmured, his eyes steady, because he knew that true authority did not rush toward conflict. It waited for the right moment to reshape it. The turning point arrived suddenly, carried by a sound no one expected. The bodyguard across pulled a pistol from his coat and fired a single shot into the pavement, the deafening crack echoing off brick walls like thunder trapped inside a narrow canyon. Panic rippled through the crowd. People ducked, gasped, and stumbled backward, unsure whether more violence would follow. The trumpet player froze, eyes wide with shock, while the club owner's confidence collapsed into pale silence. Dutch instinctively scanned for danger, but Bumpy stepped forward instead, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were walking into a quiet room rather than chaos. The echo of the shot faded, leaving behind a ringing stillness that felt heavier than the noise itself. Bumpy raised his hand, not in command but in calm assurance, and his voice cut through the tension with unexpected softness. "Enough," he said, the word carrying a weight that silenced even the murmurs of fear. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stood there, composed and unshaken, allowing the crowd to settle around his presence. The bodyguard's grip loosened, uncertainty replacing aggression, and the club owner looked at Bumpy with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. Dutch watched from a step behind, realizing that the real power in that moment came not from force, but from restraint. Harlem's restless energy slowed, the air thick with anticipation as everyone waited to see what Bumpy would do next. Instead of confronting the shooter, Bumpy approached the musicians first, offering a quiet nod that acknowledged their dignity without turning them into symbols. He spoke gently, reminding them that talent did not disappear because one door closed, and the sincerity in his voice restored a sense of pride that humiliation had threatened to erase. Then he turned to the club owner, meeting his gaze without hostility, and asked a simple question. "What kind of night do you want this to be remembered as?" The words landed heavier than any accusation, forcing the man to consider not just the present moment, but the legacy he would leave behind. The crowd leaned closer, drawn into the gravity of the exchange, and even the nervous bodyguard seemed to shrink under the weight of his own actions. For a long moment no one moved. The city's noise faded into the background, replaced by a silence that felt almost sacred. The club owner glanced at the crowd, then at the musicians, and finally back at Bumpy, as though searching for a way to reclaim control without losing face. Dutch sensed the shift and realized that this was Bumpy's true strength, not domination, but transformation. With a slow breath, the club owner stepped aside from the door, muttering that the audition could continue after all, his voice stripped of arrogance. The musicians hesitated, unsure whether to trust the change, until Bumpy gave them a reassuring nod. The tension that had threatened to fracture the night softened into cautious relief. The street exhaled, the earlier panic dissolving into quiet gratitude. The bodyguard lowered his weapon completely, shame replacing fear, and Dutch placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, reminding him without words that mistakes could still lead to growth. Bumpy remained near the curb, watching as dignity returned to a place where it had nearly been lost, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Harlem's rhythm resumed slowly, conversations growing warmer, laughter returning in gentle waves that felt more sincere than before. Yet beneath the calm surface, a new challenge lingered, a reminder that justice was never a single moment, but an ongoing choice. The night ended without celebration, only a quiet understanding that something meaningful had shifted. Bumpy turned toward the darkened avenue, his silhouette fading into the soft glow of morning lights, while Dutch followed a step behind, reflecting on how a single measured voice had changed the course of events. Neither man spoke as they walked away, but the silence between them carried a sense of purpose, as though this was only the beginning of a deeper story still waiting to unfold. Harlem watched them disappear into the distance, knowing that the sound that had shattered the night would not be remembered for fear. It would be remembered for the calm that followed, and for the dignity that refused to be silenced. The city remembered the echo of the gunshot long after the street returned to normal, and Harlem moved through the following days with a cautious awareness that something fragile had shifted beneath its surface. Bumpy Johnson did not talk about what happened outside the theater. He simply returned to his routines, walking through familiar blocks with the same calm dignity that made strangers straighten their backs when he passed. Yet those who truly watched him could sense a deeper vigilance, as though he understood that the real danger was never the noise of a single moment, but the quiet resentment that followed when power felt challenged. Dutch Schultz noticed it first, the way Bumpy paused longer at corners, studying faces not with suspicion, but with empathy, as if searching for the next fracture before it could break into something worse. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and within days the story of the shot that changed Harlem had twisted into something unrecognizable, while others whispered that powerful figures downtown were unhappy with the way he had stepped into a situation that exposed prejudice in public view. The injustice was subtle but relentless. Invitations vanished, doors closed quietly, and businesses that once greeted him warmly began to hesitate, fearful of aligning themselves with a man who seemed to challenge the invisible rules of the city. Dutch, accustomed to open hostility rather than silent punishment, found the shift unsettling. "They're trying to make you invisible," he muttered one evening as they sat in a dim cafe, watching people pretend not to notice them. Bumpy only stirred his coffee slowly and replied, "Sometimes silence is louder than anger. You just have to listen to what it's saying." The new conflict emerged when a group of young musicians, some of the same ones who had nearly walked away in humiliation, approached Bumpy with trembling voices and hopeful eyes. They had been barred from several venues after the theater incident, not because of any wrongdoing, but because owners feared controversy. The cruelty lay in its politeness. Rejection letters filled with formal language masked a deeper bias that punished those who dared to stand up for dignity. Dutch's instinct was to confront the establishments directly, but Bumpy refused to let anger dictate their path. Instead, he listened carefully, absorbing every detail of the musician's struggle, his expression softening as he realized that the real battle was not for reputation, but for opportunity. Harlem's future, he believed, rested in moments like this, quiet choices that either nurtured hope or allowed injustice to grow unnoticed. One night, word reached them about an exclusive gathering at a grand ballroom uptown, a place known for elegance but infamous for subtle discrimination. Invitations had been sent to many powerful figures, yet the musicians were deliberately excluded, their absence framed as a matter of taste. Dutch wanted to ignore it, but Bumpy sensed something deeper, an opportunity hidden within the insult. As they approached the brightly lit entrance, the doorman hesitated, unsure whether to allow them inside, and the crowd's murmurs carried the faint sting of expectation. The memory of the gunshot lingered in everyone's mind, a reminder that tension could erupt without warning. Still, Bumpy's posture remained relaxed, his voice warm as he greeted the doorman by name, acknowledging him as a person rather than an obstacle. The simple gesture shifted the atmosphere, forcing those nearby to reconsider their assumptions about power and respect. Inside the ballroom, the injustice revealed itself in quieter ways. Conversations stopped when certain people entered the room. Laughter felt rehearsed, and compliments carried an edge that hinted at condescension. A wealthy patron spoke loudly about keeping standards high, his words dripping with coded exclusion that drew polite smiles from those unwilling to challenge him. Dutch felt the weight of hypocrisy pressing down on the evening, but Bumpy moved through the crowd like a steady current, greeting acquaintances with humility that disarmed even the coldest observers. He did not accuse or argue. He simply existed, in a way that made cruelty seem smaller. When the patron finally approached them, his tone carried a forced politeness that barely concealed his discomfort. "I hope there won't be disruptions tonight," he said, glancing around as if expecting chaos. Bumpy met his gaze calmly and replied, "Only if dignity is treated like a disturbance." The tension escalated when a young singer, one of the musicians who had sought Bumpy's help, arrived uninvited, her voice trembling as she stepped into the room. Conversations faltered, and several guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. The patron's smile faded, and he signaled discreetly for security to escort her out, claiming the event was private. Dutch shifted forward, ready to protest, but Bumpy raised a hand, signaling patience. He walked toward the singer slowly, his presence offering reassurance without drawing attention to her vulnerability. The room watched in silence as he asked her a simple question: "What song did you come to share tonight?" She hesitated, then answered softly, describing a melody about resilience and belonging. The sincerity in her voice transformed the moment from confrontation into possibility, and even those who had opposed her arrival found themselves listening, rather than arguing with the patron. Bumpy turned toward the orchestra, requesting a brief pause in the evening's program. The musicians looked uncertain, but something in his demeanor convinced them to trust him. He did not raise his voice or demand authority. He simply spoke about the purpose of music, not as entertainment for the privileged, but as a bridge between people who might otherwise never understand one another. The ballroom grew still, the earlier arrogance dissolving into curiosity, and Dutch realized that Bumpy was reshaping the narrative without confronting anyone directly. When the singer began to perform, her voice filled the room with raw emotion, turning skepticism into reflection. Some guests wiped tears from their eyes, recognizing that the injustice they had accepted as tradition now felt painfully obvious. Turning point came when the patron, visibly moved despite himself, stepped forward and offered the singer a formal invitation to remain, his tone stripped of superiority. The gesture was small yet profound, signaling a shift in power that no confrontation could have achieved. Bumpy did not claim credit. He simply nodded, allowing the moment to belong to everyone present. Dutch watched with quiet admiration, realizing that the strongest change often arrived through compassion rather than force. The ballroom's energy softened, conversations becoming more genuine, and the earlier fear of disruption faded into a shared sense of respect. As the night drew to a close, the musicians gathered around Bumpy, gratitude shining in their eyes. He reminded them that dignity was not granted by others, but revealed through perseverance, his words carrying the calm authority of lived experience. Outside, Harlem's streets glowed under soft lamplight, the city feeling lighter than it had in days. Dutch walked beside him in silence, reflecting on how easily the evening could have turned into another confrontation, and how Bumpy's quiet strength had transformed it into something meaningful. "You didn't fight anyone," Dutch finally sighed, half in awe. Bumpy smiled faintly and replied, "Sometimes the strongest sound is the one you never have to make." The echoes of that night traveled far beyond the ballroom, restoring confidence to those who had felt pushed aside and reminding Harlem that justice could emerge from patience as much as courage. Yet beneath the calm resolution, a deeper tension lingered, the realization that not everyone welcomed the changes Bumpy inspired. As he and Dutch disappeared into the early morning haze, the city seemed to watch them with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Aware that the journey toward dignity was far from over, Harlem did not forget easily, and the quiet transformation at the ballroom carried a ripple that reached far beyond music and applause. People spoke about dignity in lower voices now, as though they were testing a new language they had only just learned to trust. Bumpy Johnson moved through the streets with the same calm composure, but something in the city had changed. Strangers greeted him with a deeper respect, while others watched from a distance with guarded expressions that hinted at unease. Dutch Schultz noticed it first, the way certain business owners avoided eye contact, the way conversations stopped when Bumpy entered a room, and he understood that quiet resistance could be more dangerous than open hostility. The earlier incidents had not disappeared. They had simply shifted into shadows, waiting for a moment when dignity might falter. The new conflict began with a letter slipped beneath Bumpy's door late one evening, its words polite but laced with subtle threat. It came from a coalition of influential figures who believed Harlem was changing too quickly, who claimed that Bumpy's presence encouraged unnecessary disruptions in the social order. They did not accuse him directly. Instead, they framed their concerns as advice, urging him to step back from public situations and allow the city's traditions to continue undisturbed. Dutch read the letter aloud with disbelief, his voice sharp with frustration, but Bumpy only folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "Fear writes letters like this," he said quietly. "Not strength," because it revealed how deeply Bumpy understood the stakes. Days later, whispers began circulating about a planned charity gala at a historic hotel downtown, an event designed to celebrate unity while quietly excluding those who challenged the existing hierarchy. The invitation list became a symbol of power, and many of the musicians who had found new confidence after the ballroom incident discovered they were once again overlooked. The injustice felt heavier this time because it hid behind kindness, masked by speeches about harmony that ignored the reality of exclusion. Dutch urged Bumpy to confront the organizers directly, but Bumpy hesitated, sensing that a direct challenge might only deepen the divide. Instead, he decided to attend the gala quietly, not to provoke conflict but to observe, to understand where the fracture truly lay. The hotel itself stood like a monument to old expectations, its grand staircase illuminated by soft golden light that reflected off polished marble floors. Guests arrived dressed in elegance, their laughter echoing through high ceilings that seemed designed to magnify every word. Bumpy and Dutch entered without fanfare, their presence drawing curious glances from those who recognized the weight of recent events. A host greeted them with rehearsed politeness, offering smiles that felt just a little too careful, as though hospitality had become a performance. Dutch sensed the tension immediately, but Bumpy moved through the room with quiet grace, greeting people by name, acknowledging even those who had doubted him before. His composure unsettled some guests. It was easier to dismiss a man who argued loudly than one who embodied calm authority. The evening speeches began with grand declarations about progress and community, yet each word seemed carefully crafted to avoid acknowledging the deeper injustices everyone felt but few dared to mention. One influential speaker described the city's natural order, implying that change should happen slowly and under strict guidance. The audience applauded politely, but the applause felt hollow, like an echo searching for meaning. Bumpy listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than critical, and Dutch realized that he was waiting for the right moment, not to challenge, but to reveal something more powerful than confrontation. As the gala continued, a group of young volunteers approached Bumpy, their faces filled with quiet hope. They spoke about a community center struggling to survive due to lack of funding, a place where children found safety through music and art, but now faced closure because of political pressure. The injustice was subtle yet devastating. Support had been withdrawn after the center allowed performers from the theater incident to rehearse there, and the decision had been framed as a matter of budget priorities. Dutch's frustration grew, but Bumpy listened carefully, asking gentle questions that uncovered the deeper truth. The center was being punished for choosing inclusivity over tradition. The realization weighed heavily on him, and for a moment he closed his eyes, as if measuring the cost of every possible response. The turning point arrived unexpectedly during a silent auction, when a priceless piano, once owned by a legendary musician, was presented as the evening centerpiece. The organizers intended to sell it to a private collector, celebrating the transaction as a symbol of progress. But Bumpy saw something else, a piece of history being removed from the community that had given it meaning. As guests placed bids, the room buzzed with excitement, unaware of the quiet tension building beneath the surface. Dutch leaned toward Bumpy and whispered that the situation felt wrong, that something needed to change before the night ended in another quiet injustice. Bumpy nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the piano, understanding that this was more than an auction. It was a moment that would define whether Harlem's voice could remain alive. When the bidding reached its peak, Bumpy stepped forward, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a simple request to speak. The room fell silent, curiosity replacing chatter as he addressed the audience with calm sincerity. He did not accuse or shame anyone. Instead, he spoke about the piano's history, about the generations who had found hope through its music, and about the children at the struggling community center who needed a reason to believe that their voices mattered. His words carried a quiet gravity that transformed the atmosphere, turning what had been a celebration of exclusivity into a reflection on responsibility. Dutch watched as faces softened, as the weight of unspoken guilt settled over the room. Like a gentle storm dot, rather than placing a bid, Bumpy proposed something unexpected, that the piano remain in Harlem, donated to the community center as a symbol of unity rather than possession. The suggestion hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, challenging the audience to reconsider what progress truly meant. For a long moment no one responded, the silence stretching until it felt almost unbearable. Then a woman from the back of the room, someone who had quietly supported the musicians from the beginning, stepped forward and pledged the first donation toward preserving the piano for the children. Her voice trembled with emotion, breaking the tension and inspiring others to follow. One by one, guests offered contributions, transforming the auction into a collective act of compassion. The organizers hesitated, uncertain whether to embrace the shift or resist it, but the momentum proved impossible to ignore. The piano was officially gifted to the community center, and the announcement sparked a wave of applause that felt genuine for the first time that evening. Dutch exhaled slowly, realizing that Bumpy had once again turned potential conflict into a moment of shared humanity without raising his voice. The earlier letter's warning seemed distant now, overshadowed by the quiet strength of collective action. Yet Bumpy remained humble, stepping back from the spotlight as others celebrated, because he believed that true change belonged to the community, not to a single man. As the gala concluded, guests gathered around the piano, some touching its polished surface as if it held memories they had nearly forgotten. The children from the community center arrived unexpectedly, their laughter filling the grand hall with a warmth that erased the earlier stiffness. Bumpy watched from a distance, his expression thoughtful, while Dutch stood beside him in silent admiration. "You didn't fight them," Dutch said softly. "You reminded them who they were supposed to be." Bumpy smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers. "People don't need enemies to change," he replied. "They need a reason to remember their own dignity." Outside, the night air felt lighter, yet a deeper tension lingered beneath the surface, a sense that not everyone would welcome the growing momentum of justice. The letter's authors would surely notice the shift, and their next move remained uncertain. As Bumpy and Dutch walked away from the hotel, the city seemed to watch them with renewed anticipation, aware that the journey toward dignity was entering its most challenging chapter. Yet the days after the gala carried a strange stillness, as if Harlem itself were listening for something it could not yet name. Bumpy Johnson moved through the neighborhood with the same quiet composure, but those who knew him sensed the weight behind his eyes, not fear, but anticipation. The piano's donation to the community center had stirred hope among families who had long felt invisible, yet it had also unsettled powerful voices who preferred change to arrive slowly, quietly, and without witnesses. Dutch Schultz noticed. Unfamiliar cars parked longer than usual near familiar corners and conversations that ended the moment Bumpy approached. The city was watching, measuring whether dignity could continue to grow without provoking a backlash strong enough to crush it. Harlem's nights felt heavier, its music softer, as though everyone understood that the next chapter would not be written by applause alone. One evening, a formal invitation arrived. Thick paper, elegant handwriting, and an unmistakable tone of authority. A council of influential figures wanted to meet privately, framing the gathering as an opportunity for understanding. Dutch laughed bitterly when he read it, convinced it was nothing more than a polite attempt to pressure Bumpy into retreat. But Bumpy studied the letter quietly, recognizing that avoidance would only deepen the divide. "If they want understanding," he said calmly, "we should give them a chance to hear it." The meeting was scheduled at an old theater, long closed to the public, a place heavy with memories of performances that once brought the neighborhood together. The symbolism was impossible to ignore, a stage where stories were told, now chosen for a conversation about whose voices deserved to be heard. The night of the meeting arrived with a heavy fog drifting through the streets, softening the glow of streetlights and muffling footsteps. Inside the abandoned theater, rows of velvet seats faced a dimly lit stage where a handful of men and women waited in uneasy silence. Their expressions carried a mixture of respect and resistance, as if they admired Bumpy's composure but feared the implications of his influence. Dutch remained close, watchful yet restrained, sensing that the true conflict would not be physical but moral. The council's spokesperson began with careful words about maintaining balance, suggesting that recent events had disrupted traditions that many people relied upon. His tone remained polite, yet beneath it lay an expectation that Bumpy would step back, allowing the old order to reassert itself without confrontation. Bumpy listened without interruption, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady. He did not argue or defend himself. Instead, he asked quiet questions that forced the speakers to clarify their intentions. When they described unity, he asked who had been excluded from that vision. When they spoke about stability, he asked whose comfort had been protected at the expense of dignity. The conversation grew heavier with each exchange, not because of raised voices, but because of the truth that began to surface beneath polite language. Dutch watched as the room shifted from certainty to introspection, realizing that Bumpy was not there to win an argument. He was there to hold up a mirror. The tension reached its peak when one council member accused him of encouraging unrest by standing beside people who challenged the status quo. The words hung in the air like a test, daring him to respond with anger. Instead, Bumpy walked slowly toward the stage, his footsteps echoing through the empty theater. He paused beneath a faded spotlight and spoke with quiet sincerity about the meaning of power, not as control, but as responsibility. He reminded them that dignity was not a privilege granted by authority, but a right revealed through compassion, and that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of harm. His voice never rose, yet every sentence carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, more honest. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity and hope, waiting to learn whether the meeting would bring change or disappointment. Among them were the young musicians, the volunteers from the community center, and families who had felt seen for the first time during the recent events. Inside, the council members exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken by the calm clarity of Bumpy's words. Dutch sensed the turning point approaching, the moment when the conversation would either fracture into division or evolve into something meaningful. Then came the unexpected sound. Not a gunshot this time, but the distant echo of a piano drifting through the open doors. Someone from the community center had begun to play the donated instrument outside the theater, filling the night with a melody that carried both sorrow and hope. The music slipped into the room like a memory, reminding everyone of why the earlier choices had mattered: Conversations stopped. Even the most resistant council members found themselves listening, their expressions softening as the notes reached them. Bumpy turned slightly toward the sound, allowing it to speak where words could not, and in that moment, the entire meeting transformed. He did not claim credit for the change. He simply asked the council to step outside and hear the music themselves. Hesitation lingered, but curiosity proved stronger. One by one, they followed him into the cool night air, where the small crowd stood quietly, allowing the piano's melody to fill the space between strangers. The children from the community center smiled shyly as the council members approached, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the city's future belonged to everyone, not just those who held influence. Tears glistened in a few eyes, not from shame but from the realization that dignity could be shared without anyone losing their place. The turning point came when the council's spokesperson stepped forward and acknowledged, in a voice softer than before, that progress did not have to threaten tradition. He admitted that fear had shaped many of their decisions, and that listening to the music made him realize how much beauty had been overlooked in the pursuit of control. The words carried a sincerity that rippled through the crowd, dissolving the invisible barrier that had separated them from one another. Dutch exhaled slowly, recognizing that the true victory lay not in triumph but in understanding. As the piano's melody faded into the quiet night, the council members agreed to support the community center publicly, offering resources and recognition that would ensure its survival. The announcement was not dramatic, yet it carried the weight of genuine change, a promise born from reflection rather than pressure. Bumpy stood at the edge of the gathering, allowing others to speak, his calm presence guiding the moment without overshadowing it. Some people embraced, others simply stood in silence, absorbing the significance of what had just happened. Harlem felt different, lighter, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. Dutch turned to Bumpy with a faint smile, shaking his head in disbelief. "You didn't argue them into it," he said quietly. "You let them hear something they couldn't ignore." Bumpy's expression softened as he watched the children gather around the piano. "People change when they remember who they are," he replied. "Sometimes all they need is a sound that reminds them." The resolution came not with celebration but with stillness, a deep, respectful silence that settled over the street as the crowd slowly dispersed. The earlier fears, the whispered letters, and the quiet resistance seemed distant now, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. Bumpy and Dutch walked away together beneath the fading glow of streetlights, their footsteps steady, their conversation minimal. Harlem watched them disappear into the early morning haze, understanding that the greatest power they had witnessed was not force, but the courage to stand calmly in the face of injustice and invite others to rise with them.